I just finished this Moravian stool. It came out pretty good, but I didn't film it because I had to practice this sliding dovetail. This joint is tricky, but I've got a bunch of tips that are going to help you cut it with confidence. And just like any joint, confidence starts with your stock. I'm using a single oak plank for my seat. It's nearly a foot wide, and after drying out, it's got some cup and twist. Luckily, I just did a complete video on flattening stock by hand, and you can check that out if you need to brush up on your skills. We're also going to need 2 battens, and I'm making those out of walnut. They need to be thicknessed down to 3/4 of an inch and squared up. Take your time here. Your joint will only be as good as your stock prep. Your battens should match the width of your seat, so mark them carefully, and then trim and shoot them to the final length. With your stock prepared, we can move on to layout. My dovetail slots will be 3/8 of an inch deep, and it's best to mark that with the gauge. The walls are angled at 15 degrees, and once the joint is laid out, you should check it against your battens to make sure it's going to fit. Once you like the layout, use the square to run your cut lines across the bottom of the seat. Now we're ready to start sawing. But how are we going to saw a joint line across a foot of oak and keep the saw at that 15-degree angle? Well, we're going to do it by making a guide. A chunk of 2x4 works perfectly. I'll square it up, mark the 15-degree angle on the ends, and plane away the excess wood. The last few strokes need to be careful and accurate. If your guide isn't precise, your joint will be sloppy. With your seat clamped to the bench, place your sawing guide against your layout lines and clamp it down. Remember that you need to allow for your saw kerf, so the guide will need to be a little bit inside those lines. You can use your regular tenon saw for this cut. Press the saw firmly against the guide while you saw. Once you get started, focus on the corners, working down to your depth and being careful not to oversaw those baselines. After that, you're mostly removing material from the middle, and you don't have to worry about sawing too deeply. The tenon saw isn't designed for this kind of work, and those small rip teeth quickly get clogged up with sawdust. As you get into the cut, you have to draw the saw out in between strokes to clear the dust and keep the saw cutting. When you're almost done, you can take away the guide because it adds a lot of friction. The cut you've established will keep you on track as you saw away the last bit of waste in the middle. Now, you probably can't see inside the saw cut, so take a piece of scrap cardboard and mark a line. At the ends of the joint, I'm down to depth, but in the middle, the cut is too shallow, and I need to remove a little more material. But once you saw down both sides of the joint, you still have to take out all the material in between those 2 saw cuts. That's a lot to chop out with a chisel. To make it easier, I'm going to flip that saw guide around and use the 90-degree edge to guide a regular crosscut saw. I'm staying well above my baselines, so it's okay to be aggressive and not worry too much about precision. I'm just making 2 or 3 relief cuts to break up that waste. Before I start chiseling, I'm going to screw a batten to the benchtop. This gives me something solid to push against, and I only need a single clamp to hold the work down. At the edge of the joint, I'll drop the handle of my chisel and cut upward to cleanly pop out the first few pieces of waste. Staying above my baselines, I'll continue to drive the chisel with a bevel-up cut. As I remove the waste, I'm working in layers, being aggressive with the first cut to take off about 3/4 of the wood, and then coming back for a more controlled cut that peels away a thinner layer and gets me close to depth. At the ends, I'm very carefully paring down to my baselines. The floor of the joint can be a mess and no one will notice, but these ends are on full display, and you should make them as neat as you can. To finish up the middle of the joint, this 2-handed stabbing cut is fast and controlled, and you can take off the last bit of wood with a router plane. The router plane can also trim the floor to a consistent depth. I set my router to just take the last light shaving, and then I leave that setting until both slots are done. Cutting the dovetail slots takes a little time, but it's not difficult. Now that both slots are done, we can start on the battens. To lay out the joint, I'll gauge the depth across the ends and then use my bevel to lay out the angles. When it's all marked, I'll check it against the slots in the seat and make sure these joints are actually going to fit. If anything seems off, I'll adjust the layout on these battens. Now we just need to cut out that little triangle of waste on either side, and the battens are ready for fitting. I only know about Moravian stools and sliding dovetails because of a great article Chris Schwartz wrote in 2012. It's available free online, and I will link to it down in the description. Chris gives great tips for the entire build, and in this video, I'm mostly adding to his work and trying to make it even more accessible for the beginner. For instance, you can buy a fancy, specialized plane for cutting sliding dovetails in those battens, but you don't need to. In his article, Chris says you can cut this joint using a shoulder plane, a filister plane, or just a regular rabbet plane. These are cheap and common, so let's try that. I've gauged the depth of my joint and gone over the line a few times to make a deep cut. I'll grip the rabbet plane with my fingers acting as a fence, put the blade right in that gauge line, and tilt the plane as I cut. I'm watching my layout lines very carefully, so I know I'm removing waste evenly and holding the plane at the correct angle. Getting the plane started is a little bit tricky, but it's smooth sailing after that. Now, the rabbet plane works fine, but if you've got a filister plane with a fence, it's a no-brainer. Use a square to measure the depth of your gauge line, and then use that same square to set the depth on your fence. And when you're adjusting those screws, don't use a screwdriver like some sucker. Reach in your pocket and grab the Hand Tool Hero. It's the most convenient way to adjust all your tools, and you can get yours at compassrosetools.com. With the filister, there's no guesswork. The fence keeps you right on the line, and you don't have to worry about the tool wandering around. I set the plane for a heavy cut and took out most of the waste in 5 or 6 strokes. However you do it, you're going to end up with some waste that the plane just can't get to, especially down in the corner. Chris suggests you clean it out with a chisel or back saw, and I tried, but Chris's approach didn't work very well for me, probably because he's a better woodworker than I am. So, to get my joints dialed in perfectly, I did my favorite thing in the entire world. This is called a scratch stock. It's a very old tool. It goes back hundreds of years. These are usually used to cut moldings and other decorations, but they can do any kind of detail work on the edges of boards. The tool really is just as simple as it looks. It's a block of wood with a cut down the middle, and then the blade is just jammed in there. The blade is usually made from a scrap of tool steel, most often from a handsaw. I found this saw in the trash, and it's got several broken teeth, so I don't mind cutting it up. A regular hacksaw will cut this steel, and you only need a small piece. We need clean, bright faces on our blade to get a good cutting edge. Blue tape makes the steel easy to hold, and I'm just taking it through 100, 150, and 220 grit sandpaper. After sanding, the steel is clean with no pitting. I'll cover one face with Sharpie and scribe on my 15-degree angle. This will be the final shape of the tool. I took off most of the extra steel on the bench grinder, but the hacksaw would have worked fine too. Now I'm just filing down to my layout line. To get my final edge, I'm going to work the faces of the cutter on a fine bench stone and carefully work the edges with this fine, single-cut file. The tool is ready to cut straight off the file. No need to use a burnisher or anything. For the stock of my tool, I'm just using a scrap of hardwood and cutting it into this L shape. These inside faces are going to ride against the work and act like fences, so you probably want to clean them up with a chisel. Then I'll rip all the way through the skinny part of the tool and a little bit into the fat part. With the blade installed, I'll add one screw to pinch the two halves together and another screw to keep the stock from splitting. Here's the finished tool. You can see how the cutter sits just below the fence, and it's going to cut the exact shape of my sliding dovetail. Here's a digital rendering of the tool in the cut. You can see how the scratch stock is a foolproof way to tune that joint for an exact fit. We've also made a one-page set of plans that shows you every detail on how to make your own scratch stock. And these plans are exclusive for patrons. We don't usually do this, but patrons are the reason I get to make these videos and say no to sponsorships. Go to patreon.com/Rex Krueger and become a patron for just $5 a month. You'll get these plans for free, all of my other plans for free, access to an amazing forum where you can discuss your work, and a bunch of other exclusive and early access rewards. And now that we've made our scratch stock, it's time to use it. Hold the stock firmly against the work. Angle the tool forward and push or pull. If it's not cutting, you'll need to advance the cutter down a little bit. This is a scraping cut, and it takes fine shavings, but I removed most of the stock with the filister, And it only takes a few passes with the scratch to get clean, crisp details, especially down in the corner, where the waste is especially stubborn. After cleaning up with the scratch, the batten just barely fits in the slot. That's perfect, and I can easily dial in the fit. Getting these battens into the seat can be very difficult because there's a ton of friction in this joint. There's a huge surface area. The best way to deal with that is to make the joint pretty loose in the middle and only tight on the ends. The joint will still hold together perfectly, but it'll be much easier to put together. To get this fit, you want to remove material all around the middle of the joint. I'm setting my router plane just a tiny bit deeper and paring off a little wood just in the middle of the slot. Then I'll take a couple of stopped shavings just in the middle of the battens. Finally, I use the scratch to remove material in the middle of the joint. In all of these operations, I'm avoiding the ends of the joint because that would leave a gappy fit right where people are going to see my work. Taking off material in the middle is invisible and makes things much easier to fit. When the batten goes about 2/3 of the way in, it's tempting to just wail on it, but that's a bad idea. I'll either break something or get the batten stuck part way. Instead of pounding on the batten, I'll take off a little bit more material in the middle and double check the other part of the joint. Turns out there's still a little bit of extra wood inside this corner, but that's a quick fix. To fit this joint, I actually went back and forth several times, testing the fit and making small adjustments. I'm not showing all of that because it would be boring, but you should know it's a process. Go slowly and you'll be fine. The perfect fit for the joint looks like this. It goes in easily until the last inch or two, and then you can tighten it up with gentle taps from the mallet. This joint is not glued because the wood needs to move freely. With both battens in, you're done. What's cool about this project is once you get the battens into the seat, all you have to do is add legs and you've got a Moravian stool. And the sliding dovetail works for all kinds of furniture. You can use it for stools and chairs, small tables, bigger tables. The batten is really good at holding big boards flat. So anytime you're building with solid wood, the sliding dovetail might be the answer to fight wood movement and keep something from cupping or twisting over the years. And it can be used for a bunch of other stuff, even drawer construction. And we're going to be doing a lot of those projects. I'll be back in a week or two with a full Moravian stool build and then more sliding dovetail projects as the year goes on. I'm really excited about it, and I really hope you'll join us. Thanks for watching.